So hello everyone, welcome to another amazing interview and another amazing session with Martina Williams. Used to be Barnes, now Williams. She's happily married. Woo! And today we are going to be discussing a lot about depression, burnout, and entrepreneurs and business owners, and why those things often get tangled up together, and why entrepreneurs often struggle with burnout and depression more than your average bear. So before we dive in, I'm just going to ask Martina to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her journey with these depression and burnout, and how, Martina, you can tell the story of how you and I met as well.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for that opportunity to introduce myself. Yes, I'm Martina Williams. I am a resiliency coach and have worked with many individuals who have experienced burnout. I also am formerly a trauma recovery therapist. And so I love working with high achievers. I do have work. I've been able to help Chelley. We've known each other initially when she came to me regarding, I think, being on the edge of burnout, or you were sliding into it. And I personally understand that because I also went into professional burnout when I was in my mid 30s, and I got quite sick, and it became a special interest of mine. And I'm very enthusiastic about helping individuals learn nervous system regulation and resiliency skills, especially in the day and age we live in, where there is ongoing pressure, whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you are a high achiever working in a different capacity.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting you say that, because I think even since COVID, there's certainly, on the plus side, there's been a lot more talk about burnout more widely. I think a lot of kind of corporations and companies are becoming a lot more aware of it and starting to implement wellness programs and support, mental health support for their staff and things like that. But there was also, during lockdown and everything, like a particular set of pressures that were new to many people. And all of the kind of, the financial instability and the worry about job security and the kind of the health implications, everything else, there was like this huge tsunami of additional stress on top of everyday life, which, even though it feels like we are emerging out the other side of COVID, we're very much not quite there yet. And so there's an awful lot of stress kind of still hanging around like clouds over us at the moment. And I think you mentioned they're high achievers as well. So certainly I find myself working in my business with people that would maybe not in a bragging sense call themselves a high achiever, but kind of secretly in the back of their head they think, yes, I definitely resonate with that term. And I certainly do as well. So it's kind of people that have that kind of perfectionist tendency, that would maybe think of themselves as people pleasers, that always deliver completely above and beyond what's required. Everything must be the most amazing quality ever, and kind of they hold these ridiculously high standards for themselves. And that can be, you might be a business owner, you might be a mum or dad, you might be in the corporate world, whatever it is. But it's like that kind of personality type that tends to be quite vulnerable to kind of burnout and certainly depression as well. So I wonder if you could perhaps give us an idea of some of the specific reasons why business owners, or shall we say maybe executives or people that are kind of relatively senior in corporate, are particularly prone to burnout and depression.
Yes, and I want to say I agree with everything that you mentioned in terms of COVID and the challenges that all of us were facing. And high achievers and entrepreneurs are more prone, because of the very qualities you listed: perfectionism, people pleasing, I would add having strong drive to produce, which is a very Western, well,
Mhm.
actually, maybe it's becoming a global thing now. And so also entrepreneurs, which I am one, and as are you, and we're both high achievers and probably really appreciate that about ourselves. uh, we we're very by nature self-reliant. We're
Mhm.
self-reliant by nature and
Mhm.
often have a hard time delegating, or maybe we have no one to delegate to.
Mhm.
The perfectionism drives us to put in so much extra effort that alone can lead to exhaustion when we're pushing our nervous systems beyond their natural capacities. Also, that's going to put us at risk for burnout. And when we look at the pandemic, especially the first 2 years of the pandemic, everyone's nervous system was being pushed beyond its limits, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we all have what's called surge capacity in our nervous system. So it's helpful to have surge capacity if we have a big project that's due or a big report to write or other demands on ourselves that we can just kind of push our nervous system and then go back to baseline.
Mhm.
However, I've noticed with entrepreneurs and high achievers, that push may be constant.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. And can you think of any other risk factors in your experience with risk factors for burnout?
Yeah, I think I would say in a business owner context, one of the things is, as you know, having to wear all the hats as well. And so that constant sort of context switching between marketing and then client delivery and then finances and then admin and then, and that's all just in the same morning, right? And
Yeah.
you have to sort of, in order to be successful in business, especially if you're a solopreneur or someone that has a really small team, you actually have to be quite good at all of those things for your business to kind of flourish and to run correctly. So the sort of demands that we put on ourselves to be really good at everything are quite unique if you think about it in the sense of having a 9 to 5 job, for example, or working for like a larger company. You don't get employed in a role as like general amazing person, that unless you're the CEO obviously, and even then you have specific responsibilities. You tend to go in a particular department, you might have a particular specialism, you might be managing one project, and that is very much like the kind of the guidelines and the boundaries of what you're responsible for delivering. Whereas when you are in business, you are responsible for so much, particularly when it's your business. And so there's like this added level of super high expectations and pressure that I think we do feel, where sometimes just all gets a bit too much. And you mentioned there as well something I really picked up on around feeling like you have to do everything yourself and being very self-reliant. And obviously that's an amazing trait to have, because it makes you incredibly strong and very resilient, but it also makes you very likely to not ask for help, or only ask for help when you're like absolutely on your knees and the world has blown up. So it's like, to me, that's almost like a pincer movement of having these ridiculously high expectations on yourself, feeling like you have to do everything. And then at the same time being really reticent to let go or to delegate or to allow other people to come in and like help you to sort of receive support, feels like you're failing or like it's weakness or something like that. And I think there's an interesting parallel there with the sort of the stigma behind depression and burnout, and how people are like very afraid to kind of reach out for therapy or medication, or that sort of admitting to yourself and other people like, hey, I'm struggling here and I need some support. It feels quite alien to people that are really high achievers. So yeah, that's what springs to mind about that.
Yeah, thank you. All of that is so rich. I appreciate you articulating all of that. And I imagine the entrepreneurs out there are like, nodding their head in
You're
agreement.
not alone. You're not alone.
You're not alone. And there is a different level of risk if everything is reliant upon you as an entrepreneur, as opposed to, say, a different kind of structured organization that is going to have some stopgap safety nets built in there. And one of the things that makes it so hard to ask for help is that it can feel as if we're failing, as if we're somehow not enough or not good enough or not doing our job well enough, that it's a personal failure. And who wants to feel like that, especially if you are a high achiever, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, one thing that you mentioned to me along those lines of making it difficult to reach out, I think about the stigma around depression, right? And how it is maybe much more acceptable to think that, oh, I've gone into burnout. That's certainly better than going into depression. And I find it curious that the research supports that burnout is often driven by depression. And again, we go back to the nervous system piece of accidentally pushing our nervous system beyond its limits all the time in order to get the job done, or in order to meet the standards we think are super important.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive into the nervous system side of things for a little bit, because I think one of the things that certainly helped me destigmatize my own depression in my own head, and just for context here, for people that don't know me, I've had multiple depressive episodes in my life. I've also had a couple of professional burnouts as well, and Martina has been an amazing help in sort of literally getting my head around that in every possible way. But one of the things that really sort of helped me get over myself, I guess, when I had my first clinical diagnosis of depression, even though I'd, looking back, suffered many times before with it, but just hadn't had medical help with it, was that it's very much a physiological issue. And of course, there can be a lot of emotional triggers to it, or like if you have kind of a very emotional time in your life or a traumatic event, then that can sometimes trigger depression. But there is a very strong physical element to what's happening in your body, your brain, your nervous system. And it's not about, not being able to handle things, or like just pull your socks up and you'll get through it. Kind of that kind of old school rhetoric around it is actually the kind of message that keeps people silent and not reaching out for help. So I'm really passionate about being as open as possible about these things, and really kind of getting factual about what is going on in your body and your brain when depression or burnout actually hit. So could you give us a little bit of an overview in a physical sense of what happens when you might be suffering from one of those two?
Yes, absolutely. And so if we start with the nervous system and we think about each of us having natural ebbs and flows throughout our day, right? It's like we get up in the morning, maybe we have our coffee and we start to climb a bit, and then maybe something not great happened at work and then we go down, but then we recover from it. And so if we think about like between these two lines, let's call this our resiliency zone. And within that, if we have enough bandwidth, we're going to be able to ebb and flow quite naturally. But what happens when stressors hit our nervous system, especially repetitive stressors? So this happened both in COVID, with the main early years of the pandemic. And it also really applies to entrepreneurs and to high achievers, is that when we get repetitive hits, okay, then we're going to go in one of two directions quite naturally, physiologically speaking. We're either going to go above our resiliency zone and get cranky, frustrated, short-tempered, anxious, fearful, irritable.
I can relate. Yep.
Yeah, me too. Or if we go below, like if we go below, we start to get in the part of the nervous system where we start to have a degree of what's called dorsal collapse, meaning we're going to be prone to depression, exhaustion, fatigue, isolation. And that's a very hard place to admit to oneself, especially those of us who are high achieving. And so a couple of things in addition to that is the impact that it's having on your body biochemically, which is all these stressors are producing more and more cortisol, which can lead to insomnia for one thing, and digestive issues, etc. And our brain, what we suspect happens is that our neurotransmitters get depleted, especially those of us, like Chelley and I are both highly sensitive people. And so that means that our nervous systems and our brains are more highly sensitive than 80% of the population globally. And so we want to think in terms of, okay, how do we work within our bandwidth, but also how can we expand our bandwidth? Which I think that this is part of the work that you do, is helping entrepreneurs expand their bandwidth through different strategies and practicalities. Right?
Yeah.
And so is that helpful? Do you want me to talk any more about the nervous system at this juncture?
I think that's great. I'm intrigued to know the top and the bottom of the resiliency zone, as you mentioned there. I can definitely relate at one point or another, in fact many times, of like drifting into both of those. So is there, like, clinically speaking, is the top band kind of anxiety or burnout, and the bottom one is depression? Like, what's the difference between those two zones if you're going up or down?
Great question. Yeah. So if we're going above the resiliency zone, then we're going to be prone to anxiety. And for those of us who push ourselves too hard all the time and we are in a constant state of anxiety, then that can lead to burnout and depression, and you're dropped down into below that line, right?
Yeah.
So it's often those of us who really push hard and are prone to anxiety, which actually is a sign of high intelligence. I don't know if you knew that, but it is.
I'll take it.
Right? That it didn't really initiate as depression to begin with, but being up there in that high zone, in that anxiety zone for so long, then that can lead to emotional, physical, mental exhaustion, right? And drop us down into depression or burnout because of exhaustion, right? And high achievers, we're going to be prone to push. And the symptoms of burnout, to me, look super, super similar to depression. Similar.
Uncannily.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think sometimes it is depression, but culturally speaking, we're not going to talk about that because we're successful people, and successful people don't get depressed. 2 thumbs down on that one.
Agreed. I love it.
Not true.
In fact, we're more likely to get depressed. How interesting. So I think that's a really good segue into talking a little bit about what the warning signs might be. So we've accepted that we're these super high-flying, high achievers, perfectionists, entrepreneurs, executives, mums that are amazing at what they do. And we've accepted that we might be a little bit more prone to this kind of thing, just with our perhaps like mental makeup and our personality, and maybe we're a highly sensitive person, etc. So you mentioned there sort of anxiety or kind of anxious symptoms potentially being almost a precursor to depression. Could you tell us a little bit about the particular symptoms, like the telltale signs that we might be edging our way into that above the resiliency zone area? And so should we say, call that like phase one? And then what are we looking for when we're going into that? And then when we're actually sliding under the resilience zone and we're going into depression and burnout, what are we looking at there that we should watch out for?
So those are great questions, and I'll try my best to answer them. So we've all had the experience, those of us especially prone to anxiety, but I think all human minds, what they do is they think and they ruminate. And it's actually been shown from neuroscience that our default is we have something called the default network mode, which is we go into rumination. Another way of saying that is we go into racing thoughts. And so we all have stressful days where our mind might be racing, but if your mind is racing every day and you start to have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, or you're starting to feel some challenges with your memory, things maybe are dropping through the cracks, and you're not used to that, right? Because you're used to having excellent job performance. It's like, okay, having more fatigue than is understandable as an entrepreneur or high achiever, and really losing that joy or that looking forward to doing work. It starts to feel like dread, because dread is a degree of anxiousness, right? It's a severe degree of anxiousness. It's dread. Oh no, I just can't get through another day. I can't do that. And we start to feel as if everything's overwhelming. And we start to feel often a level of hopelessness, right? And so so in that phase one where we have that anxiety, that racing mind, trouble falling asleep, all the things that I just listed, when we start to go into a depression, like burnout, that next phase, then the fatigue gets quite noticeable. And it's a fatigue that a good night's sleep doesn't abate the fatigue symptoms, right? They don't abate. Having a weekend or weekend after weekend where you don't have the energy to do anything fun or pleasurable, you start to feel maybe that you're having low self-esteem or low confidence in your ability to really do things well. And you might feel like you just really want to isolate because the system doesn't have the energy to interact, maybe except at work, right? And so that isolation is a real sign. We're pulling away from loved ones. And then if we notice we're also pulling away from work friendships, those are all really signs of going into a depression. And you might also lose your appetite, or you may only have appetite for chips and chocolate, Oh, no, the 3 C's: chips, chocolate, and coffee.
My staple diet. I love it.
Right, right. Let's see. Can you think of any that I'm missing on the depression side in terms of warning signs, maybe that you've experienced or noticed in others?
I think one symptom that comes up for me with the anxiety is actually noticing flare-ups of other existing conditions as well.
Yes.
So I have an ectopic heartbeat, which is basically a benign arrhythmia in my heart. And usually it's not noticeable to me. But when I begin to notice it and I wake up in the night and it's thumping, basically it's sort of, it beats and then it stops and then it beats really hard again, which it can be a bit unnerving at times. But usually it's sort of like kept on the down low. But when I get stressed and anxious, I actually, even just sitting down in the middle of the day, will suddenly feel it kind of coming up and sort of taking me unawares. So I think if you have those maybe other conditions that are being managed quite nicely in the background, and then all of a sudden they start to flare up, I think that's a good indication that the stress levels in your body are really quite high. And for me, things like, irritability, so like getting really irritable with people that I love, or kind of people who are just, like customer service personnel or something like that, who's totally not their fault that like something's happened, but you get irrationally annoyed about everything and you feel like the world is just trying to, beat you down and stuff. Generally just wanting to sort of claw your own eyes out. And then for me, like when I slid into depression, like probably one of my worst episodes and my worst burnout was just feeling so emotional all the time. And I remember, before beginning work every day, I would literally just cry my eyes out just for no real reason. I think that's the weird thing about anxiety and depression, is you mentioned dread, like you're feeling like something terrible is going to happen, but you don't know what it is, and there's no rational explanation for what it might be, but you just think like, oh my god, something awful is going to happen, like and likewise with depression, like everything just feels very generalized, but you can't really kind of put your finger on anything. And just that feeling of kind of, I think the overriding words in my head when I have a depressive episode is like, I've done everything that they, whoever they is, have told me to do, and it still doesn't work. Like I'm still not happy. I'm still not whatever it is that I thought it would like fix. And so that sort of like feeling of disillusionment, that like, is this really all there is in life? I thought I'd done everything right and now here I am. And so that kind of feeling. So I know, like now, having been in and out several times, as soon as I start to have those kind of feelings, I'm like, hang on a minute. So yeah.
I'm so glad you brought up those points, because when we are pushing so hard for so long and depleting our surge capacity and staying way up too high, which often we think as a high achiever that what is required is more pushing, and then your body starts to show those symptoms. Like for some people, they might have a strong inflammation response, and all of a sudden their joints are achy, their back muscles are always sore, they start to have digestive problems, or maybe the headaches come on, right? So when it's gotten to the physical level where you start to really notice the physical symptoms, we know we're pretty far along into that burnout or depression. So knowing your baseline is really important. And one way we can know our baseline is observing what our body feels like when we're in our resilience, our emotions feel, how we feel mentally. If we can know that, then we can start to detect earlier if I'm up too far into the override anxious zone or slipping into the collapse or depressive zone.
So yeah, it's just bringing that level of self-awareness and kind of compassion and really like observing yourself, I guess.
Yeah.
And so let's talk a little bit about if any of our listeners and watchers find themselves they're like, oh gosh, yeah, like all of those symptoms, I've either felt them in the past or I'm feeling them right now, perhaps all at the same time. If you are, I've been there, don't worry about it, it's all good. Given that there is a small amount of, as you said, surge capacity, so like if you have a day you're feeling quite anxious, please don't panic. You know, you're not going to have a mental health crisis. You will probably be fine if you spend the majority of your time in your resiliency zone. But let's talk a little bit about some practical tips and help now for people that let's use our phase 1 and phase 2 analogy again. So to begin with, let's talk about if you start to feel those feelings of, you know, you're not sleeping correctly, you're irritable, etc., etc. How can we bring ourselves back down into our resiliency zone from being in that kind of that upper bracket?
Yes. So what we can know is if we're over the line into that upper bracket, that our nervous system is too stimulated. If we're staying up there, we are in too high a stimulation zone. And so we want to think about doing activities that are calming, right? For some people, it's yoga. For some people, it's meditation. For some people, it is watching a lovely movie or gardening or anything that can help begin to bring us back into the resiliency zone. We think of calming activities, as opposed to if we've dropped into that below zone, we want to think of more activating activities. And so I think in the minor stages, if we're catching ourselves here in that phase 1, our corrections don't need to be severe, right? It can be, oh, I need to get back to the group that, you know, for me, it's the YMCA. I've got to get back to that group 3 times a week to do my exercise. Or I need to do some things that feel uplifting, right? And energizing. I need more rest. So when we're in that phase 1, these tend to be more minor adjustments. That makes sense. But then if we go on into phase 2, whether it's phase 2 up here or down here or up here that then goes to down here, I think the hardest thing to do if the anxiety has been sustained for a long time, I think it's very hard to pump the brakes. Right. So if we recognize we're starting to go there too often, we can gently tap the brakes in the nervous system and do those calming activities. But if we've been sustained up here for a long period, it will be difficult to tap the brakes. So the brakes are going to have to be applied for a longer period of time. So for right, like maybe also the emergency brake at the same time. So, like I think about, let's say we've been trying to handle our anxiety at work by working all weekend long, you know, maybe for months and months and months. And okay, one example is of really applying and sustaining those breaks is going to be, all right, I'm going to set boundaries with myself and maybe work that set the boundaries say no working on the weekend. And that's going to be hard for high achievers, because if that is a coping strategy, it's like, oh, I don't want to let go of that coping strategy. right? And for those of us who have parts that are high producers, like one of the worst things we can do is slow down, take a break, and
Yeah.
not produce, right?
Yeah.
And those strategists within us don't know that downtime is actually productive
Oh,
in a
that's
situation
juicy.
like
Yeah.
this, right? Yeah, I'll repeat that one. Downtime is actually productive, the most productive. And in fact, this is one of the reasons we need to have downtime built in. And when we start to go up here into the anxiety, that's more than a day or two, it's like, okay, where's my downtime? Right? Where do I, okay. And then, again, mindfulness and meditation, or whatever form that takes for you, that's also going to help you if you can start to do it on a regular basis. That's like you applying the brakes, right? Applying the brakes. Am I forgetting anything in the high zone that you can think of before I go down to that low zone?
I think everything you said makes complete sense. I was just laughing internally so much about about what you related there, because I think as a high achiever and as you said, a high producer as well, it almost feels like one might be allergic to resting.
Yeah.
And I know certainly myself and my partner as well, the same, in that, you know, if you almost like don't know what to do with yourself when you do have downtime, because you think, what do I do now? Like, shouldn't I be, you know, I really struggle to take an actual day of resting. I always feel like, I'll just go do some gardening, or I'll just go to the shops, or I'll just, you know, even if I'm just having a rest day, I really struggle to rest, although I am getting better at it. Weirdly, you have to practice resting, I think, if you're a high achiever. But yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And I love what you say about the tapping the brakes as well. I think it's so true, whether you're going above the zone or below the zone, the further into that journey you get, the harder it is to take the actions that you know you need to take.
That's
and that
right.
is the same with depression as well, in the sense of like, you know that actually going to see your friend for a coffee is going to be a really great thing for you to do, but you're so far in the hole that you can't actually bring yourself to do it. So let's talk a little bit now about, like, if one does find themselves quite far down the rabbit hole and you're thinking, like, you know what, just taking the weekend off isn't really going to touch the surface of like what's going on right now, what can people look to do to help themselves when things get a little bit more intense?
Yeah, so this is the time when we need to call in support, and massive levels of support, whether that is our social network, our partner, the help of someone like you, Chelley, the help of a mental health care provider, and especially if you feel like you've dropped into depression and you're staying there, all the research points to a dual approach as being the most effective, right? One is getting on medication, which some of our viewers may not like that, and that's okay. That's not a requirement. This is just what research has shown, paired with therapy. Now, at the same time, I think that depending on how far you are into, say, the extreme zone, sometimes a coach is going to be able to help you make the mindset shifts that are needed, because our brain, whether we're in high anxiety or low depression, our brain is going to go back to old grooves, right? It's going to go back, it's going to default into old grooves, and those old grooves that contributed to you getting into the high or the low zone are going to get activated, and the thoughts that you're going to hear are not going to be the truth. They
Mhm.
sound like the truth. That's how they catch us.
Mhm.
That's how they,
Yeah.
kind of hook us. They sound like the truth, but they're not. And so getting the support of a professional coach or therapist can be so helpful in getting out of those grooves.
Mhm. Mhm.
And when you're in the less extreme levels, going back to that for a minute, taking the breaks, having a downtime, setting the boundaries, making sure that you get food, right?
Mhm.
I don't know, like, how many high achievers in senior management do I know who don't even have lunch, or if they have lunch, it's gonna, while they're going to be doing this while they're typing, you know.
Yeah.
So, but when we are then going back to the extreme places, if you're able to exercise, and I mean, maybe that's starting to simply walk, just getting outdoors and walking, that's a good start. We know that exercise gives us all those great hormones and the boost in serotonin, and all the endorphins that are so fabulous for us. And especially with depression, we need connection. We need
Mhm.
connection. We don't feel like we want connection,
Mhm.
but we need connection, right? And then, okay, so then how can we support ourselves so we can sleep, so the nervous system can begin to recover,
Mhm.
right? And how can we support ourselves in getting some healthy food so the body can also repair itself?
Mhm.
Those are really important things that we know can help,
Mhm.
right? So, okay, can you think of any things I'm missing?
I think, yeah, it's, I know we've had this discussion before, the irony of like how the simplicity of the actions that we need to take to heal ourselves is often our downfall, because as high achievers, we often credit ourselves with a lot of intelligence.
Yes.
And we operate in those realms of the intellect where everything is complex and interesting, and we sort of pride ourselves on being able to understand complex concepts and things like that, and so when we get sick, we perhaps have a tendency, and I definitely do, to think there must be some like magical formula or some kind of 12-week program that I need to go on, where there's some secret that someone's going to teach me, or I need to read 36 really in-depth books to kind of figure out how to fix this. And actually, the irony of the situation is that most of these situations come about from a lack of the most basic self-care.
Yeah.
And as you said, like a great example there of like, when was the last time you ate something? Are you drinking enough water? Like, are you actually seeing daylight at all, like during the day? Are you working 7 days a week? All of this kind of stuff is like, it's literally like self-care 101. It's so obvious, and we resist it so much because it seems like almost stupid, or kind of like, oh, of course we should drink enough water, like how dull. But this is the consequence of actually doing, like, rolling our eyes at every single practice of self-care and taking care of ourselves, and it all just mounts up to a point at which our systems just go, no, you're all right, thanks, I'm I'm out of here, you clearly don't care at all. And so I think it's really interesting. And one thing I wanted to ask you was, say for example, we were in our resiliency zone, we've gone up into the above zone, so like the anxiety zone, and we've then crashed down into the depressive zone. We know that things like connection and sort of being as proactive as you can about getting support is super important. And one thing I really struggled with is a strong word, but sort of had a big question mark over when I was in my last depressive phase was your body, from what we've discussed today, sounds like it is going into a kind of cocoon, if you will. So it's been sort of bashed around like a bee in a tin in the anxiety zone for so long that your nervous system, your body, your brain, your soul is just so tired, over it, exhausted, that you've crashed. You've crashed. And so even though we know that exercise is good for us, even though we know that we should go out to that social event to help us recover, my personal experience was that my inner intuition was saying, you must rest, you must rest. And so it feels weird and weak to do that, to actually sort of give in to the depression, I guess, is one way you could sort of articulate it. But I had this kind of inner sense that like I did actually just need to curl up under a blanket for however many days, weeks, whatever, and let myself cry and let myself sleep for 15 hours a day or whatever it was, to actually allow my system to sort of heal and to regenerate itself. So in your sort of professional experience and opinion, like, is depression our body's way of telling us that it's been trying to get our attention for so long and we haven't listened, that now it's almost like forcing our hand to rest?
I think so. I think so. And for those of us who are used to overriding signals from our nervous system and signals from our body, it's almost like the body mind is going to, as you say, force your hand. It's going to you'll come to a screeching halt, right? Your body's going to say, I cannot participate in this anymore. And I always say the best way to prevent burnout is to prevent burnout. It's like one of those Zen koans, right? And I think it can be quite helpful to have a plan to prevent burnout, right? Which could be I'm looking for particular signs. I'm going to commit to enough sleep at night, food, exercise. When I start to feel this way, I'm going to see where can I reduce my stressors, right? That's like having a plan. And then it can help to have somebody that you really trust, whether that is a professional like yourself or a dear friend who loves you unconditionally, to say, like, if you really kind of sunk deep into a depression, to give them permission to articulate that to you. Like, Chelley, I'm noticing like just the spark is gone in your eyes and you just look really sad, or you just look tired all the time. Do you think you might be heading toward burnout, or do you think it might be time to get some help? And what I have found, and this may be true for you as well, is that it's like if we have our first major clinical depressive episode, to me, that first one is the most terrifying in the world, right? But then you live through it. If you live through it, then if it happens again, you're like, I've been here before. I'm actually not going to die. And we build on that experience. And the same with burnout. It's like, oh my goodness, I really am feeling sort of symptoms again. And as much as I don't want to rest, I'm going to rest prophylactically, right? And we want to be able to support our body, our emotions, our mind, our nervous system to stay within the resiliency zone, right? And if I'm an entrepreneur who's having a hard time juggling everything, right, I can come to you And you can help me in very practical ways, not only get back into the resiliency zone, but hopefully make it a little bit wider and cushier. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we do really get hijacked by parts of us. Those high achieving parts are like, I don't have time to rest. I don't have time to eat. I don't have time to sleep. It's like, ding, ding, ding. Those alarms should be going off in your head. Go to your plan.
Oh, I love that. Love that. And you know what, that I don't know about you, but like a plan totally appeals to me as a high achiever. I'm like, oh, I could make a PDF of it. It could be really organized.
Yes, absolutely. It can be a work of art.
It could be an absolute work of art. Yeah.
Yes. Brilliance has come up with. Yes. and just know that this is going to sound cliche, but asking for help is the opposite of weakness.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Hashtag just saying. Yeah, I think for sure, like consistency and sustainability are two words that, let's face it, they kind of have quite boring connotations, and they certainly don't appeal to those of us who love the chase, who love high achievement, who love winning and success and smashing goals and all of that good stuff. If you talk to someone about consistency, they're like, boring. And we much prefer to kind of ride that flow of like, one day you're on top of the world, the next day you don't know what your name is, but from this is just my personal experience, actually embracing those two concepts, and you can come up with other words for them, like intentionality is a word that really resonates with me, so I tend to use intentional quite a lot because that feels good to me. But actually, like, being quite disciplined with yourself about the consistent habits that you promised yourself that you will stick to. So in my experience, like this past year and a half, I've really committed to an exercise practice. And I found a couple of practices that I really enjoy, a couple of forms of exercises that I genuinely am excited to do. I think they're so much fun and I really look forward to doing them. And I am really, really committed to doing those every single week. And there's a few other things around like bedtimes and sleeping and, diet and making sure I surround myself with positive people and protecting myself from, toxic situations and things like that, which you only sort of learn the hard way, really, when you've maybe worked really hard to build energy or healing in yourself, and then something comes along and kind of knocks you down again. And you begin to get like very discerning about who you interact with, where you spend your time and energy, what's important, what's not important. But as you said, that kind of the playbook, if you will, or the plan is like your foundation of principles, of habits, of routines that keep you on the straight and narrow or in that resiliency zone, so that you might have the odd day or maybe even week which is really stressful, but you know that you've got your toolkit ready to kind of look after yourself, and you have autonomy and control over that as well. Like, you're not, that kind of, it comes back to the like asking for help thing. Like, if you've got this, right, you have your toolkit, you have the power to like heal yourself and to bring yourself back to center. And I think that's like a really empowering thing, because depression can really rob you of your sense of autonomy and confidence and self-esteem. And so, yeah, just being able to do everything that we can to save ourselves before we plunge into those horrible depths is definitely worth having.
Absolutely. And, I'll just add a quick personal tidbit here, which is that it took me, I'm a slow learner in some ways. It took me some decades actually to get committed enough that when I could feel my blood sugar drop, because I'm highly sensitive, that I would actually make myself go eat. Right. And that seems so simple, but for those of us who are high achievers and high producers and like you say, love this mental realm and love producing, etc., it's like, I think we can often have a lot of denial about the fact that we have a body, right?
Yeah.
Just like, and maybe, you know, having a body feels like it's this really heavy weight we just have to keep dragging along. But if you commit to those things like you have with your exercise this last year and a half, the payoffs are huge because you cannot sustain a certain level of work and pushing your nervous system indefinitely without a crash and burn. And so if you've gone through a professional burnout, then you learn from it, hopefully, like you do, that you survived the first depression, you're learning. And so I'm going to take things more seriously. So we can encourage our viewers to go ahead and take things more seriously.
Take yourself more seriously.
Take yourself more seriously in this respect.
Yes, absolutely.
Don't continue the override dance. It's not worth it.
Oh gosh, yeah, I so relate to that. Like I even like all day, every day, you just get that nudge of like, I'll just finish this.
Yeah.
Even it's just like silly things like, you know, when you like need to go to the loo and you've needed to go to the loo for about 3.5 hours, but you just told yourself like, oh, I've got a call now. Oh, I need to just send this email. I need to just put that. And like by the end of it, like, this is ridiculous. Like it literally takes me about 2 minutes to go to the loo, but I'm still here prioritizing an email over like a basic bodily function. Like it's so ridiculous, but it's just,
I know.
Yeah, I don't think you can get out of it.
Well, the good thing is you're not alone.
Exactly. Yes,
you're not alone in this, right?
That is the comforting thing. There are many wonderful people in the world that not only are going through this with you at this exact moment in time, but also who can really, really help you in this position. And it is, I'm saying from my personal experience, entirely possible to create a life where you genuinely do feel really excited to get out of bed every morning, and you are, for the vast majority of your time, grounded, balanced, happy, thriving, and it takes work, but it's entirely possible. So I just wanted to just give a little bit of love to anyone that's watching this and feeling really not great, and really, you know, worrying or stressing about everything. Like, please know that you're not alone, and there's many wonderful people, including Martina, who can help you, and you will honestly look back in a little while and think, gosh, that was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I'm really proud of myself for getting through it and for knowing myself even more now. So yes.
Well said, so beautifully said. And I just appreciate so much the invitation to dialogue with each other on these super, super important topics and issues. And know that if you reach out for help, that means you are a really strong badass, right?
Yes, I love it.
Like, how does that date me, right? Like Cabbage Patch in the 80s or
Who knew badass dancing was like this? Yeah. It's good to know. Clearly I am a massive badass, because that's how I dance a lot of the time. So Martina, if anyone watching or listening wants to come in and chat with you and potentially work with you, can you tell us a little bit about where they can find you and what specifically you help people with, in relation to what we've talked about today?
Yeah, so you can find me at thebraveintrovert.com. And I love working with high achievers and highly sensitive people and introverts. And I work with teaching nervous system regulation skills, which then help regulate emotions. And I also help individuals get to know their passengers on what I call the spiritual life bus that we all have. Get to know our passengers so they don't keep hijacking us, like the perfectionist or producer doesn't continue to hijack us, so that we can truly be led by self, that we can be self-led in the healthiest possible ways. So that's in a nutshell.
Amazing. And yeah, if you're interested in learning more about the spiritual life bus that Martina just mentioned there, we have a really fantastic interview on parts theory, which you will find in the CEO self-care series as well. So if you're interested in diving into that, check out that interview as well. So Martina is amazing. I can personally recommend her because I worked with her. Woo, she is fantastic. And if you are in a place where you would like some more practical help with calibrating your business, your mindset, and your kind of everyday rituals and routines in your business to actually, as Martina said, expand that resiliency zone, give you a bit more breathing space, and actually prevent burnout and depression from ever happening, then please get in touch with me. It is what I absolutely love to do, and I would love to hear from you and potentially work with you. So let's wrap up. I'm sure we could talk about this for hours because it's just such a juicy subject. But is there any other little tidbit of information or inspiration that you would like to share with us all before we go, Martina?
Listen for the small, still voices inside. That comes from your intuition. Listen to them because they will lead you home and they'll lead you to help and safety.
Oh, that made me feel quite emotional. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us. It's always a pleasure. And no doubt we will speak again soon.
I imagine. Take
Bye.
care. Bye.